In this video, you will learn about the different mood forms of verbs in English, which includes the subjunctive. Mood is the form that a verb takes to indicate the attitude of the person using the verb. And attitude is really referring to only a couple of specific things here, so it's not quite as broad as tone that we talk about in analysis of writing, but I'm going to go over that in a few minutes. There are three moods in English: the indicative, the imperative, and the subjunctive. The indicative mood is used to express facts, opinions, or questions. It's the most common mood in English because, as you can see from the definition, it covers a lot of ground. It's kind of the default way that we speak. So here are a few examples. Almost any sentence could constitute an example, with the exceptions of the imperative and subjunctive types that we're going to look at in a few moments, but here are three. The Mets won the World Series in 1969 and 1986. Fact. The Mets are a hardworking team. Opinion. And finally, do you think the Mets can make the playoffs this year? As a question. The imperative mood is used to express a direct command or a softer request. Put your laundry away. It's a direct command. Get me a glass of water, please. Request. In imperative sentence, the subject is the understood you. If you want more information about this, I suggest watching the video about classifying sentences by purpose, because that talks a little bit more about the imperative sentence structure. And finally, subjunctive, which is, I guess, the trickiest. It's the one that we probably don't use as much. It's the one that probably most of you are familiar with from your world language classes, not really from studying it in English, but we do have it in English. Just like in the world languages that have subjunctive, the subjunctive mood in English is used to express a suggestion, a necessity, a condition contrary to fact, or a wish. So the subjunctive is kind of, these are the things that are of unreality, the things that we think should happen or that we'd like to happen. And that's when we use the subjunctive, and we're talking about those things that don't already exist and that haven't already happened. It's kind of our wishful thinking verb. So here are a few examples of those. I recommended that she try the kale salad. A suggestion. It is essential that you finish the test before the end of the period. Necessity. If I had time, I would train for a marathon. Condition contrary to fact, meaning I don't have time. If I had the time, I would do this, but I don't. And I wish I had a chocolate chip cookie. Obviously, a wish or hope or desire for the future. Some of the verbs that might require a subjunctive include this list. This is not all the verbs that might take a subjunctive, but these are some of the most common ones that you'll see. Ask, demand, prefer, recommend, suggest, command, require, insist, propose, request, hope, and wish. The present subjunctive expresses a suggestion or a necessity, and it usually follows this pattern. You'll have a subject, and then one of those verbs from the previous list. Then you'll have the word that. That's going to be introducing usually a noun clause that's going to function as a direct object of that suggestion verb. And that clause has its own subject. And the verb in that clause is what takes a subjunctive form. So let's look at an example. I recommended that she study for the test. So I is the subject of the main clause, recommended is the verb. What is being recommended? Now I have a noun clause, the thing being recommended. It starts with that. It has its own subject, she, and the subjunctive form of the verb, study. The subjunctive mood is the only mood in which verbs have a different form. So from the previous slide, I suggested that she study for the test. If we were speaking in the indicative mood, we would say she studies, she has been studying, or she studied, but in the subjunctive, the verb takes the base form. In this case, study. So here is the conjugations of the verb study, a comparison between indicative and subjunctive. As you can see, the only difference lies with the third person singular. He or she studies in present indicative, and he or she study in the present subjunctive. And here are the conjugations of the verb to be in both indicative and subjunctive. You'll notice here that every form varies. That has something to do with the fact that be is an irregular verb. But here the subjunctive actually does follow the rule of taking the base form at every level. So here's an example with to be. The Board of Education recommended that Ms. Carter be granted tenure. So this actually follows the same pattern that we were just looking at. The Board of Education is the subject. Recommended is one of those special verbs. Now what's being recommended? That Ms. Carter, subject, be granted tenure. If we were speaking in indicative, we would say Ms. Carter was granted tenure, or we would say she is granted tenure, she is being granted tenure. But when we speak in subjunctive, we just use the base form be. The past subjunctive is very similar. It usually expresses a condition contrary to fact or expresses a wish. It can follow the same pattern as present subjunctive, where we have the subject, verb, that, subject, and then subjunctive form. So I wish, subject, verb, that you is the subject, were feeling better. Were is the subjunctive form here. Past subjunctive often contains an if clause. So if this condition were true, then I would do blah, blah, blah. The clause that begins with if is what contains the subjunctive verb form. So here's an example. If I were retired, I would practice yoga every day. So if we leave off the if clause for a moment, I would practice yoga every day. The would actually we're using because we have a conditional construction, meaning that certain conditions are necessary in order for the action of that main clause to take place. And in that if clause, under those conditions, that verb form is placed in the subjunctive. Notice how it doesn't say, I was retired, right? And this is often where students will think there's a subject-verb agreement error. They'll say, well, shouldn't it say I was retired? But what they're not picking up on is the fact that we actually are using the subjunctive form, so it is correct to say I were. Notice that it doesn't actually matter what order you put the clauses in. We could also say, I would practice yoga every day if I were retired. It doesn't change the fact that we have subjunctive or the form of that subjunctive verb. So here's a little just quick practice in identifying those forms. There's more practice on the website if you want to keep going with this. For each of the sentences below, determine whether the italicized verb is indicative, imperative, or subjunctive. So this is where I suggest pausing the video, recording your responses, and then starting the video up again to hear the answers. Okay, number 1, her mother insisted that all the students be invited to the party. Be is a subjunctive verb because we have the word insist, and insist is one of those kind of along the lines of recommend, suggest, command. It's one of the ones that requires a subjunctive verb. We also, maybe you picked up on the fact that be is in the subjunctive form. Number 2, Aaron, please stop tapping your pencil against the desk. Because this is a polite request, we have the imperative form. Number 3, are you looking forward to the weekend? Sentences that are questions are indicative. Number 4, I wish I were able to take a nap today. The wish needs to have a subjunctive verb. And I will wait for you by your locker this afternoon. That is, of course,